welcome to our fourth ever Deep Dive show. I'm your host, Talkshow, and today we're going to be talking about the unequal opportunity and racism in education. We will also be having a special guest join us today so they can share their amazing ideas with us. We also have our co-host here, Jeremiah, which will also be talking about censorship in schools, and I will be talking about the achievement gap. Would you like to introduce yourself, Jeremiah?
Yeah, my name is Jeremiah Cox. I am the co-host of this talk show today, and I am pleased to be able to talk today about the educational censorship that is facing racism education in our country. And we'll be right back to talk about this after a short break. So, racism has been really a topic that has been covered recently, and how this has impacted education has been especially a topic of conversation. So especially in recent years, as laws have targeted how we talk about race and how teachers can and cannot teach about race, this has come under threat, under fire in schools, and it's been really important to talk about what students can and cannot be exposed to. For instance, during the last year alone, PEN America, a free speech advocacy group, counted 155 bills introduced in 38 different states that would censor what teachers say or teach in classrooms. And that was in 2021. Already in 2022, we've had 111 such bills introduced in 33 states, as the ACLU documented. For instance, some of these laws are the Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, which would just ban discussing sexuality and gender identity in schools and allow parents to actually sue school boards if they believed policies violated this law. Other bills in Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Tennessee would ban teachers from introducing concepts that one race or sex is inherently superior, or that any individual is consciously or unconsciously racist or sexist because of their race or sex. Governors in Idaho and Oklahoma recently signed bills like these into law, but bills in Iowa and Tennessee are awaiting governor signatures. All these bills have very different stipulations and specific impacts upon students and teachers, but they all often resemble President 45's executive order banning diversity training for federal employees, and they each have very, very significant implications. But to demystify this complicated mess that can often become state legislatures and statutes and laws, we'll focus in on one particular state, Texas, that has adopted a quite expansive educational censorship bill. As Jennifer Bendery of the Huffington Post wrote last June, Texas GOP lawmakers signed into law a bill that aims to stop teachers from talking about racism and other controversial current events in the classroom. This legislation states that social studies teachers in public K-12 schools may not be compelled to talk about current events or public policy issues that are controversial. And if they do, they're required to present them without giving deference to anyone's perspective. Now, of course, this is great in theory, but it's unrealistic and unfair in practice. For instance, as Michael Powell of the New York Times wrote last December, one curriculum official went so far as to suggest that teachers should seek opposing perspectives if they read a book on the Holocaust. Now, according to a recording acquired by NBC News, the superintendent later apologized, saying that we recognize that there are not two sides to the Holocaust. But this shows the extent that some people are willing to go to censor education and put the racism that students are exposed to at a minimum. Going back to Jennifer Bendery's article, this Texas law explicitly names several topics that teachers are prohibited from talking about. Teachers are not allowed to say that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. Teachers aren't allowed to say anything that would indicate that students could be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or even partially because of their race. Students aren't allowed to make judgments about an individual's moral character, standing, or worth, and how that is influenced by their race or sex. Students aren't able to or teachers aren't allowed to make students feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress based on their race or sex. And they aren't allowed to teach anything about meritocracy, such as how the meritocracy system or the myth of meritocracy is based on racist and sexist ideologies. When talking about slavery, teachers aren't allowed to teach that the advent of slavery was central to the founding of the country. In fact, they can't teach anything other than that slavery was a deviation from, betrayal of, or failure to live up to the country's founding principles. And definitely teachers cannot talk about the 1619 Project. This is explicitly named in the Texas statute, saying that teachers are not allowed to talk about this award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning project launched by the New York Times Magazine that puts slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the center of American history and narratives where they belong. Now, these Texas laws don't explicitly ban conversations about race, but functionally they might as well. Because according to State Democratic Representative James Tallarico, who is a former middle school teacher, the bill is written in a clever way so that you can talk about race in the classroom, but you can't talk about privilege. It doesn't outright ban talking about race, but the idea is to put in landmines so that any conversation about race would be virtually impossible. And he added that the idea is really to whitewash American history. And in tandem with these laws that censor what teachers can expose students to, some people in power have taken additional steps. Last fall, Texas State Republican Representative Matt Krause emailed a list of 850 books to superintendents. Some of them were half-century-old novels, like The Confessions of Nat Turner. Some of them are more recent works, spanning from queer authors to LGBTQI, or to racialized authors. And there are many different books that are included in this list. Some are literary critiques, some are narratives. But for whatever reason, Representative Matt Krause has identified these books as offensive and not fit to be taught to public education students, whether they're, in his opinion, pornographic or controversial or racist or whatever, what have you. But most of these titles are very educational and providing a marginalized perspective on the world that is often not recognized. And as Ariana Garcia of December 2021 wrote, the San Antonio School District responded to this list, and they removed 400 of these titles from their libraries shortly after Matt Krause published this list and sent it to superintendents. And this sparked outrage among students and community members. In the San Antonio School District specifically, one online petition was circulated that was asking the school district officials to return those books to the libraries. And part of the petition read, these books serve as an important place in our community. They not only provide important educational resources on Black history, they also provide a safe haven for many young LGBTQ students who take comfort in this representation. And they went on to state that many Black and LGBTQ students in the district are appalled and hurt by the district's decision to comply with Matt Krause and suppress their harmless resources and stories. One student wrote in a public Instagram post and went so far as to say that this removing of books from the shelves was a blatant act of racism and homophobia on the school district's part, with absolutely zero consideration for their own students. So students are undoubtedly impacted by these educational censorship laws. Their experiences, their stories, their sense of belonging is all impacted. And when they aren't able to see people like them or hear stories like theirs, or even stories not like theirs, they lose out on a personal and an educational experience. But these censorship laws also have a tremendous impact on teachers. The Texas law, for instance, goes a bit further than those of other states that have in the past. And it prevents teachers from encouraging their students to participate in any public policy advocacy as part of their civics or social studies classes. And the language is really confusing. It's written so broadly that it applies to virtually everything. Like, even as far as writing your own elected officials is not technically allowed under this Texas law, or registering to vote as part of a class activity, something that many civics and social studies classes do regularly every year, is now banned, supposedly. And Safraz Ali, who is a teacher in the United States, he has been for 17 years, has grown wary of this uncertainty. He read this law and is not sure what to do. So he eventually called up the Texas Department of Education and just asked them, what is critical race theory? How do you define it? And what does this law explicitly state that I can and cannot say in classrooms? And he never received an answer. He said it's like walking into a dark room. How can you provide students with an education if you don't know what you can even say in a classroom? Educators are now banned from having students feel any sort of responsibility, blame, or guilt because of their race or sex. But some, like Representative Krause, have even gone a step further, suggesting that a teacher might overstep simply by assigning a book that troubles a student. And the teachers are all but like slapping their foreheads in frustration over these laws. To teach Shakespeare, to teach any great literary work, or even history, the Trail of Tears, the white gangs lynching Black and Mexican people in American history, to teach anything worth learning is to elicit swells of emotion. And out of this can arise introspection, self-recognition, sorrow, critique, empathy, social emotional learning. And English teacher Ann Nas adds that it's a teacher's responsibility to prepare students emotionally and intellectually with a diversity of voices for a diverse world. But how can we do this? How can teachers have a chance of educating their students if they can't talk about things that are controversial, challenging, or troubling? From an educational perspective, this law simply doesn't make sense. And just to add insult to injury, the bill was passed in Texas likely under an unconstitutional way. When the bill was being heard in the House, the lawmaker noticed that the Senate had added unrelated comments to the bill, amendments to the bill, which is of course not allowed. And so the bill was sent back to the Senate, where it normally couldn't have been fixed in time. But Republican Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who runs the state Senate, bypassed the rules, and he got the bill through on the 137th day of the legislative session. Now, Texas constitutional processes prohibit passing a House bill after the 135th day of a legislative session. So technically, they broke the Texas congressional rules and possibly violated the Texas Constitution in the process, but this doesn't present a viable legal challenge for the bill. And there haven't been any major legal challenges yet. So as of now, the bill still is signed into law and remains that way until someone finds the justifiable legal grounds to tackle it. And this sort of attack on education and using schools as a political battleground and political theater has a long and deep history in America. It goes back to the founding of the country, but just to give a more recent example, in the 1990s, New York City Chancellor had to remove the mention of the book Heather Has Two Mommies because it was sparking too much controversy. And more recently, a liberal California school district ruled that Of Mice and Men and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn were racially insensitive and thus no longer mandatory to read. Ultimately, knowledge is power. So educational censorship has been happening for decades among all groups of people: liberal, conservative, Black, white, Hispanic, rural, urban. The main concern now, and why we're talking about this on the DeepDive show, is that these educational censorship battles are being used to further racist agendas. Because knowledge is power, if white people can inhibit the spread of knowledge, if white people can prevent people from learning about how America is a fundamentally racist country that has yet to achieve equity or even start to offer reparations for centuries of inflicted trauma, if white people can inhibit that knowledge, the spread of that knowledge, then white people can maintain their power. So that's why this is such a concerning issue. These laws and censored books and red tape for teachers and setting students up to fail. How can we expect to continue the momentum of anti-racism? How can we expect to educate about racism, to deconstruct racism, and move towards an anti-racist future if today's students aren't even exposed to challenging texts or aren't even allowed to talk about racism or anti-racism or activism or diversity in their classrooms? And so that's the central challenge today. And we're going to come back after a brief break to discuss. We have a special guest joining us today. It looks like we're having a few technical difficulties, though, so just hang with us. We're going to sort this out in just a couple minutes, and we'll be right back after a short break. back now, and we're joined by Cameron Samuels. Cameron, thank you for joining us today. Cameron is a community organizer and student in Katy, Texas, where they've led efforts for LGBTQ plus inclusion, racial justice, voting rights, and gun violence prevention. Cameron has coordinated the Freedom Week initiative to distribute hundreds of BIPOC and LGBTQ plus books to students in their school district. And in the transition, we saw a photo of Cameron outside the Texas State Capitol, where they recently spoke on the Senate floor against Senate Bill 3, a motion which would whitewash education and partisan gerrymandering, both of which disregarded the Texas's BIPOC majority. And this was one facet of Cameron's efforts during the 87th Texas legislature. So I want to start with you, Cameron. When you heard about the passage of this educational censorship bill last June that Governor Greg Abbott signed into law, how did you react? How did that make you feel? And what have you felt since then?
When I saw that this law was signed by the governor, I was not surprised, but I was very frustrated to see how in many states across the nation, there have been efforts to build a more inclusive community, especially in recent years. And in other states like Texas, there has been an effort to drive backwards in terms of social progress. And that is hurting the people of Texas and many other states who don't have the same experiences or the same culture that supports them in those states that others in the country do have. And it was also very concerning and disturbing to me that this law impacts education, the foundation of what citizens and residents in the nation come from. They are built upon this education that sets them up for what should be success. But yet when there are efforts to control this education from a very partisan perspective, that's where society becomes conditioned to disregard certain perspectives and worship other perspectives that are harmful, that are intolerant and ignorant.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I suppose it makes sense living in a state where you feel like these protections and these sort of social innovations and ways to make more inclusive societies are coming under attack. It makes sense that you would expect such a law to be passed, but that's sad to hear. Why is this so important? You mentioned that education is really central to how we engage in our country, how we live in this world, but why have you chosen to fight for this issue? Why have you chosen to distribute books to hundreds of people around your school district? What makes this a really important issue for you?
Students, especially junior and high school students, are very vulnerable individuals. It's a very precarious time in their life where a lot is happening, a lot is changing. They're coming into adulthood and they're in this huge crunch of time that's supposed to prepare them for what society is going to not only provide them, but bring them down sometimes. And education is supposed to support students in not only the knowledge and the skills needed to live a successful life, but also the experiences that can help them become who they are and can help them navigate the difficulties and struggles of life. And when censorship is valued over compassion and support, that can bring students down. And as an educational institution, which should have the utmost responsibility to support students when they are instead categorizing certain students in groups, considering them harmful, their identities harmful, or blowing their value out of proportion and disregarding it. That is what harms students. When we've seen this large-scale effort to attack critical race theory as if it was a bad thing, or to remove books that include perspectives of the BIPOC community and provide so much valuable and affirming content to support these individuals, it really hurts students on an individual level. It can seem so meaningless to people who don't experience the struggles that come from identities like that of the LGBTQ and BIPOC community, but these policies truly are affecting individuals in the community as a whole, not just from a broad standpoint, but from that individual standpoint. Someone might be struggling with mental health issues because of their queer identity, or they might be suffering from discrimination and hostility among their peers because of their racial identity. And it's so important that these students are represented in the education that they receive, rather than being targeted, singled out, and disregarded for their identity.
I definitely agree with that. Personally, as a high school student, I definitely feel that too, and I feel that this law probably impacts everyone in general. And I just wanted to ask you a question. What made you decide that I'm not going to sit here and watch this happen, watch people be affected by this? What made you stand up and say that I want to create a change in this situation?
A lot of it comes from self-interest. I myself struggle with mental health. I struggle with my queer identity, and I have so many other identities that cause that struggle for me. And I know that my peers, they have similar struggles, sometimes worse struggles. And it's necessary for us to bond together to advocate for what we believe is right, rather than sitting idly by and letting injustice take place.
Yeah.
If I don't do anything myself, I feel powerless. I don't feel like I'm doing enough. And it leaves me feeling hopeless and powerless. So standing up is not only a way to advocate for what I feel is right, but it's also a way to stand up for others who are unable to stand up, people who are closeted, people who are fearful of receiving criticism, or even worse, because they're taking a public standpoint. But when there are many people speaking publicly in support of compassion over hate and love over injustice, then that is a tangible step toward a more inclusive society.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing all that, Cameron. I want to circle back to what you were talking about with how important it is for students to feel like they're represented and have access to inclusive resources that reflect their identities. I totally understand your point there. I wonder if you could talk to the kind of flip side of that, and the importance of students who may not necessarily be grappling with their own identities, who may be cishet and comfortable in who they are, but unaware of the struggles that their peers are going through, who are queer, who are racialized, who are facing daily struggles that they just can't comprehend. How has educational censorship and sort of the taboo that has been placed around talking about queer identities, talking about racism, how has this impacted the culture of students and the culture of high schools in Texas? And what have you seen change, I guess? Have students just not been exposed to things and then become more insensitive and more discriminatory? Or how is this played out, do you think?
It's really difficult to understand another person's struggle when someone lives their life so effortlessly and comfortably. And it's not something that someone thinks about all the time. They just live their life without seeing that underlying struggle that someone has. And that has been seen in several school board meetings that I've been to, where there have been conservatives speaking against the LGBTQ community and against what they're claiming is CRT and is harmful to the community. They're using fear to rally support for their agenda when their agenda is so harmful, because not only is it disregarding queer and BIPOC identities, but it's also targeting them. And there have been very harsh comments, such as someone telling the school board that they were not elected to unblock LGBTQ websites that were previously blocked before. They've disrupted meetings, and they've said homophobic remarks, racist remarks, and it's just so harmful to see that outnumber and drown out all the other voices speaking in support of compassion. It's really heartening for students to see people speak in support of compassion and equity and inclusion and justice. And when that's not present, or when it is very minimal in comparison to all the hate, it really leaves people feeling hopeless. But the most important thing to do is be represented, represent other people in speaking toward compassion. And even if someone is just the only person in the room speaking toward that, like I have been at a couple school board meetings, it's still so important, because without that one voice, there would be no voices and there would be no power at all.
Yeah, definitely. Speak compassion. I like that. And also, I love that you're going to school board meetings. That's a fantastic step that all of our viewers should take. Something that I haven't done as much as I'd like to, but definitely feel is an important step. We got to wrap this up, but one more quick question for you, Cameron. What resources do you and activists like yourself, I know you have several contacts throughout your school district and the state that are doing similar work to push back against this censorship. What do you need? What do you need to be successful? How can we support you? How can ARC support you? How can our viewers support you?
As just mentioned, being that voice, even if you're the only one. Speaking at school board meetings is a great way to represent your viewpoints, your values, and get your voice across, because when you amplify your voice, you amplify your power, and that's how social progress is driven forward. Speaking at school board meetings, giving testimony on or in state legislatures is a wonderful way to be that voice. And there are also so many other ways. I think the most important aspect of supporting these values is continuous and active involvement in this advocacy, because just acting just one time, that's not sustainable. That's not going to move social progress forward in a substantial way. But if you're able to remain involved, you're continuously acting and staying informed about current events, current issues, and you're developing your own opinion of it, and you're taking a public stance on it. That is what's going to rally support from the community, what's going to raise awareness and give people hope and a platform to get more involved and build momentum for a movement. bonding together with shared values toward a common goal, that's the power of organized people. And that's the power that makes progress happen.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't have to be something huge. Just keep doing it and keep showing up, for sure. Awesome. Well, we'll transition now to Adonai. Adonai, I'll let you take over. We'll be right back after this short break, and Adonai will present about inequity in education.
Hello, my name is Adonai, and I am your host for today. Today, we'll be talking a little bit about the achievement gap and racism in education. We know that more than 60 years after the Brown versus Board Education Act, school systems in the United States are still separate and unequal. Today, we'll be talking about how the achievement gap still affects us even 60 years later, and why the achievement gap is still a thing. Well, educational outcomes of students of color are not at all related to the stereotypes and racist bias that people have that students of color may be lazy, unintelligent, and uneducated. But these educational outcomes are highly related to the fact that students of color are not given equal access to opportunities and resources that are necessary to support them in their education. On the report of studio@how.com, structural racism is so deeply embedded into our society and communities that survey respondents were more likely to attribute the difference in test scores to parenting and student motivation than to any inequities that arose from past public policies. As we can see from this fact, we can tell that people relate to these educational outcomes and the achievement gap to student motivation, and how these stereotypes and biases are put on students of color and are used to blame them for this achievement gap. But these stereotypes are not true. What they actually do is they cover the real problem. And the real problem is that students of color are not given equal access as their white peers to better education. And so, I'm going to be talking about why the achievement gap is even a thing and where in the world it came from. Well, there are many factors that contribute to the achievement gap in education. And one of these factors, as I stated earlier, started from all the way as late as the 1960s, where most African American, Latino, and Native American students were educated in segregated backgrounds and schools that were poorly funded, given low quality teachers, had fewer resources, and were very lowly supported by the US government, while white schools were highly funded and highly quality teachers. And these students of color were excluded from attending higher education institutes and colleges, and African Americans, after they did graduate from their higher education and segregated schools, were only able to get, the best job they were only able to get in the 1960s were teachers. So once the end of segregation happened and students of color and white students came together as one, they had very different educational backgrounds. Students of color had been going to schools that were poorly funded and had low quality resources, and they were going into schools with other students that had been highly supported. And because of this, as stated by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967, in elementary schools, Negroes lagged 1 to 3 years behind whites, and their segregated schools received substantially less money per student than do the white schools. Yes, this quote might be from 50 years ago, but this still occurs today. According to a study by Stanford University, while the achievement gap has declined since the 1970s, it still remains significant today. Based on standardized test scores, white students are roughly 2 years ahead of Black and Hispanic students in terms of education. As you can clearly see, even in 1967, when schools became integrated and students of color were with white students, they were 1 to 3 years behind because of their educational opportunities. And now, even 50 years later, we can still see this effect through standardized test scores. For example, Professor Samuel Myers Jr. from the University of Minnesota conducted a trial in 1996 to test whether poverty was the main cause of the achievement gap on the Minnesota Basic Standards Test. Results found out that 25% of African American students passed the math test and 21% passed the reading, compared to the 74% and 58% respectively for whites. As mentioned earlier, this is not just a problem in 1996, but we can still see it shown 20 years later. In 2019, there was a 45-point national scoring gap between Black and white students in mathematics, and a 34-point scoring gap between white and Hispanic students, according to a national 500-point math assessment taken through the National Assessment of Education Progress Program. As you can see from these statistics about test scores, they show us the reality of the achievement gap and how segregation is still affecting us today. Well, how about school funding? MLK talked a little bit about how African Americans were 1 to 3 years behind those of their white peer students because of how their segregated schools were poorly funded. But this is still a big problem today. According to a study done by the U.S. Department of Education, schools with 90% or more of students of color spend a full $733 less per student per year than schools with 90% or more white students. And across the countries, schools spend an average of $334 more on white students than on every non-white student. As you can tell from the statistic, you can see that the school funding problem is still a problem today and is even happening individually to each person in our school district. Even today, students of color are not being given correctly funded resources to support them for their education. So as you can tell from these facts that I just stated, that the achievement gap is not necessarily due to the fact that people have stereotypes and biases, that students of color may be lazy and unmotivated, and it has nothing to do with the lack of motivation in the student or even in the parent, but it has to do with the history of discrimination and how the U.S. government has been disregarding students of color and have not been properly funding them for their education. So 60 plus years later, we are still affected by this. Seeing how the achievement gap still affects us today, let's dive into why it is still here. Well, there are many other factors rather than just the history of segregation, but current factors like economic differences have caused a great divide in the achievement gap. Factors like incomes and socioeconomic status create gaps in the access to educational resources that parents can provide at home. Differences like neighborhood conditions and enrollment in high-quality early childhood programs, education programs, creates this opportunity gap. According to a study done in 2013, children with a low socioeconomic status enter high school with an average literacy skills 5 years behind those of high-income students. So as we can tell, segregation and race are not the only two factors that have to deal with the achievement gap, but things like income and status also have to do with this big gap in education and how we are not given the right and equal access to education opportunities because of our situations that we were born in. And the third factor, and the last factor that I'll be talking about for the achievement gap, is something really big, and I purposely saved it for last because it is not the least. It is really important and is part of the solution to the problem of the achievement gap. And this factor is student-teacher relationships. As explained by Rhonda Bryant from the class organization, she suggests that many teachers and counselors have not developed sufficient relationships with students and their parents to truly understand their cultures, life histories, and socio-political circumstances. Without this understanding, teachers and counselors fall prey to stereotypes about African American students and their families. These stereotypes cause teachers to consciously and subconsciously lower their standards for African American students. Continued work in this field is essential to help shape federal, state, and local policies that improve education quality for African American students. So as we can tell from this quote, what Ron Bryant is trying to explain is that teachers need to develop relationships with their students and their parents to truly understand not only what's going on in the school, but outside of the school, to truly understand their cultures, their life histories, and their life outside of school. And by doing this, teachers will have a better understanding of what their students need to get access to these resources. But the big problem is that teachers are not taking their time to do this. And what happens when teachers are not taking their time to develop good relationships with their students and just know about their more personal life and history? This causes teachers to fall prey to stereotypes about students of color and people with different backgrounds. And they begin to lower their standards for these people because they subconsciously or consciously have biases and stereotypes that these people are not motivated, they're lazy and unintelligent. But as we can tell, this is not due to these stereotypes, but mainly due to the history of segregation and how students of color have been degraded. And I feel like the main problem and why this student-teacher relationships are not happening is because, personally for me, as I live in Minnesota and go to Chaska High School, is because of the lack of representation in teachers. To be completely honest, I have never had a teacher that looks like me. I've never had a Black teacher in all of my 14 years of going to school. So for that really affected me personally and my views. And I feel that this lack of representation caused a big gap in understanding between the student and the teacher, as they do not take time to truly understand this achievement gap and where it actually comes from. And as I stated earlier, I was talking about a statistic that said that survey respondents more likely believe that this was just due to the parent and student motivation. And I feel like the big problem in high school is that teachers mainly are like, oh, A, F, C, D, that's your problem, you're going to fix it, right? But they truly don't understand that it's not only due to the parent and student motivation, but it's also due to the fact that there was a long history of them being degraded and not being given equal access to opportunities. And because they don't have access to the opportunities, they aren't able to get where they are today. And I personally feel like gifted programs really show this, because personally, when I was in elementary school, I was put into a gifted program. But what I've noticed, and it was not due to the fact that there was very little diversity in my school, but I've had friends that I personally knew were smart, and I knew that they had the capability to get into these gifted programs, but they weren't in it. And for the past 3 years in elementary school, when I was in that gifted program, I haven't seen a single student of color. And I've always kept that in my heart and really wondered why, but I've never really addressed that issue. And I feel like that's because most students of color are greatly overlooked because of the lack of representation and the lack of student-teacher relationships. As stated by rethinkingschools.com, only 6.9% of students of color, compared to 23% of white students, had access to gifted and talented programs. Because of these stereotypes and misunderstandings, students of color aren't given equal access to resources, and is another effect of the achievement gap. So now that we have addressed the issue and talked a little bit about the factors and how economic differences, how the history of segregation, and how the U.S. government has been poorly funding schools and how that has affected us today, I want to talk a little bit about how we can fix this issue. I personally believe that we should make sure that everyone obviously has equal access to these opportunities. And how we can do that is by explicitly telling students of color and white students, everyone personally, and making sure that these students are exposed to their options, like higher courses, accelerated courses, AP courses, PSEOs, and etc. Make sure that everyone has access to the information. So I encourage you, whoever's watching, parents, students, teachers, etc., to advocate for better opportunities in your local schools. And that can just start from telling your friends or your neighbors about the opportunities that you may know about in your local schools. So after this, we'll be discussing a little bit about the achievement gap with our special guest, and Jeremiah. So, I kind of want to talk a little bit about, according to an article written by Jason Grissom and Christopher Redding in 2016, teachers of color are more likely than white teachers to exercise discretion on behalf of students from their same racial or ethnic background, and similarly for white teachers for white students, such that student probabilities of being assigned are higher with own race teachers. So I personally want to ask you guys, have you had diversity in your teachers, and how has that affected your learning? And seeing people that are personnel like you and not having someone to look up to as a teacher, how has that really affected your learning? Because I know personally that has affected my learning. So how has that affected you guys with learning?
So in my school district, and specifically my school, there is a lack of diversity in the administration, despite the fact that my school is majority minority. And when it comes to teachers, it's about the middle point in between that. But it's still predominantly white. And that's really something that I don't think a lot of people recognize if they are white. They see their teachers just as they see themselves, and they don't recognize that there is a lack of diversity. But for the students of color, I feel that they don't concur with that, and they see the lack of representation, which it's really odd to me that such a diverse school district does not have a diverse teacher and administration population. That is something that needs to be addressed. And recently, actually, I noticed that we had a new administrator in the school who is Black, and that really set a light in my head saying that is not like everything else, and that was different from how it's been before. And it really gave me that sense of it lighted me up. It made me feel that hope, and it hopefully will show a clear message that students don't see themselves frequently in the people who are in those positions of power above them, and that if there are more teachers and administrators who do look like them, have similar identities as them, then they're going to have a more personal connection to their education, and that's going to support them.
Yep, I definitely agree. Personally, I feel like I relate to that too, because there is very, very little diversity in Chaska High School, and it's pretty much like demographic wise, like 80% white and like 20% like BIPOC and students of color. So I definitely feel like that's really important, because there is barely any diversity in our teachers, and I think that's really affected us students of color personally, because we have noticed it, and I feel like that has caused a big gap between like the student and teacher and their relationships. So I personally wanted to know, how does your school, like I know Minnesota and Texas are probably different, and just different schools differ, but how does your school really focus on addressing inequity in your guys' schools? It could be like in your curriculums, in your programs, or does your school have some type of like inequity group that focuses on fighting for that, or how does that work?
Jeremiah, would you like to go first, or would you like me?
Yeah, I can speak to Minnesota schools, and you're in the high school that I went to right now. And
Yes.
when I was there, they launched an sort of restorative justice initiative, because there were many racism incidents, I suppose that's what they were calling it then, instances of white students exerting their privilege over non-white students, or just being reckless and insensitive. And so the district took it upon themselves to create this restorative justice system. And from what I've heard from administrators and from students in the school currently, is that it's been fairly successful, and they've been able to swiftly address issues that arise with white students being racist in whatever capacity. And I wonder if that's even a concern in Texas. If in Katy School District, for instance, where you are, Cameron, if administrators are even having conversations, if, let's say, for instance, it makes state headlines or local headlines that a white student had just used a racial slur against a non-white student, how would your school react? That's an example of something that has happened many times and has hit news headlines just last week for not the school that Edna and I went to, but a school that's close by, Edina High School. How would your school react to that? Would it be a similar reaction in Texas, or would it be just like almost brushing it off and ignoring it?
For larger, more targeted incidents, there was one a couple years ago whenever I was in junior high, and the school and law enforcement did respond, and they took a very proactive and very serious approach, which was really good. But I don't believe there was any conclusion to it, unfortunately. And there have been countless times over the last several years that there have been incidents that have taken place. There have been conversations between students and administrators that have left students even more struggling with their mental health, or have harmed students in the way they walk through life. There have been those incidents that have gone unnoticed, and they aren't being addressed because many times those incidents are occurring to people who are left to feel powerless. But as we are advocating for inclusion and combating racism and other forms of hate, we have been making positive strides toward eliminating these incidents and supporting students in being who they are. And it's really, I feel very optimistic about it. We are moving in a very positive direction, which is really great. But it's no easy challenge. It's no easy struggle. It's no easy effort to advocate for this and push forward. But it's something that we remain persistent, and we succeed as we struggle.
Yep. I definitely can relate. I feel like in Minnesota schools, ever since I don't know if you know, Minneapolis has had like lots and lots of like big racial incidents that have been happening, just like not even in schools, but like in general, like Dante Wright, George Floyd, Philando Castile, and etc. And I feel like after George Floyd, it really hit Minnesota really hard. And after that, I feel like schools have been a little more proactive. There's definitely been like a bunch of racial incidents that are still happening today, but I feel like our schools take like a little more action. I feel like they do like walkouts maybe, or like personally if they have like their own groups in their schools or clubs, they do walkouts. So do those things happen in like Texas schools? Do you guys do like walkouts if like any like racial incidents happen? So how do you guys like address that? I know it's kind of like the same question that Jeremiah asked, but is there like any specific thing that you guys like do?
There was a walkout in support of gun violence prevention, but other than that, there haven't been many strong movements to walk out or raise awareness about these issues. The largest things have come from club meetings, club activities, school board meetings. There haven't been much more than that organized by students. But that's something that is due to the stigma and due to the hostility or criticism toward these movements, and the lack of support and lack of the freedom to exercise this direct action.
Jeremiah, do you have anything else to say?
Oh, I'm just saddened deeply to hear that it's almost like the oppressors have subdued their subjects in Texas. The lawmakers who are trying to subvert democratic processes and trying to really muffle and stifle the exposure that students have to racism, and they're not, and students aren't really pushing back. It's almost like they've been fed this for so long that it's not a big issue. It's desensitizing. And of course, there are people like you, Cameron, who are pushing back, but it's not a mainstream thing. And that's just sad to hear. Encouraging the Minnesotan students are doing that, but still sad to hear about Texas. We got to conclude here shortly, but Cameron, do you have any final remarks for our viewers?
I think my closing remarks would be to stand up for what you believe in. If there is an issue that is troubling you, harming you, or harming someone you know, then remaining silent is not going to do anything, and it's going to leave you powerless. So advocating publicly by yourself, with others, that is what's going to make a difference. And everyone has the power if they have a voice.
Yep. Thank you so much, Cameron, for joining us. And that was the end of our show. Thank you guys all for watching. Just remember, as long as racism exists, we're never doing enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yep.